everyone, welcome to the November-December LD topic analysis. So, the resolution is resolved the United States ought to adopt a wealth tax. So, before I get into the nitty-gritty of the resolution, first I just wanted to introduce myself. Obviously, I'm a part of Equality in Forensics, but I am a rising junior at Ridge High School, and I'm the captain of my school's LD team. This is my third year of LD debate. I've won Pensbury, reached elims at a lot of national tournaments, qualified for NSDA, and reached elims of NCFL. My favorite argument to read is the cap case, so definitely reach out to me if you're interested in that. I feel like we don't see enough cap debaters on the circuit, but that's kind of irrelevant. Let's get into the topic analysis at hand. So, first, a bit of an overview. Let's start some definitions of the topic. So first, you have the word ought, as you see in pretty much every single LD resolution, implying a moral obligation. I think like most resolutions, people will say that this justifies a value criterion of morality if you're doing traditional debate, and then you'll see this in its fun, funky forms of things like permissibility and different frameworks in progressive debate. The more interesting definitions I think we get into are with the word adopt, as opposed to what you saw with the living wage topic, where it said require, which definitely implied some sort of legal implication. Adopt seems a little bit more informal, and when you look in the definition, it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be legally binding. I think this is going to be interesting on a lot of like counter plans, especially process counter plans when you're looking into how it's going to be implemented and the process by which the living or not living wage, a wealth tax is being implemented. But secondly, I think it can be very interesting in T framework debates. A lot of times people will be like, oh, the resolution is supposed to be implemented through legal means and through legislation, but I wonder if you could use the definition of adopt to get out of that. Okay, the third biggest definition you have to look into is a wealth tax. So on basis, most websites agree that a wealth tax is just a tax imposed on individuals' net worth. This means, or net wealth. This means it's going to be on all your assets, so stocks, properties, etc. It's not like your classic taxes we have right now. So right now, obviously, you pay a ton of taxes. The two main ones that relate to a wealth tax are income taxes and capital gains taxes. So on one hand, you have income taxes. How do those work? Well, that's a direct tax on the money you're earning. So let's say you're earning like $60,000 a year or like whatever, right? You're taxed on that direct income. But let's say the way your income is split is that it's $60,000 and then a bunch of shares, right? A lot of companies like Amazon pay their workers like that. You're not getting taxed on those shares directly because that doesn't count as like direct income in a way. You're only getting taxed on the actual income in a way that you're bringing in. So then the second tax that kind of checks back on this is the capital gains tax. So what a capital gains tax is it's a tax when you sell stuff. So for example, if you were to sell your shares or sell stocks, you would be taxed on any money you get as a result of that. And that's going to be your capital gains tax. So it seems like, oh, well, we have all these things covered. Why do we need a wealth tax? Well, there's this funny thing called tax evasion, and it's so prevalent in the world of capital gains and income taxes. So, number one, capital gains taxes are way lower than income taxes. So, income taxes for the highest wealth, it can go up to 37%, but capital gains is only gonna go up to like 15 to 20%. There's also a lot of ways to avoid capital gains taxes. For example, let's say you're really involved in like the real estate market. If you buy a house, and then or let's say you buy a house, you sell that house, and then you take all the money you earn from selling that house and then invest it into buying another house, you're not taxed on that at all. So, what does this mean for the topic, and what does this mean for definitions? It means that the wealth tax is going to cover and should technically cover for a lot of the loopholes you're seeing in income and capital gains taxes. It should theoretically be on these, like the complete net wealth. So, you can look to an example of Jeff Bezos. Right now, he has $200 billion in wealth, but $165 billion of that is unrealized shares. What this means is that he has a ton of money in the stock market, but he hasn't sold these shares, so he's not being taxed on it. On the other hand, if you had a wealth tax every single year, like if the wealth tax was yearly, you would be taxed on these billions of dollars in wealth. So Jeff Bezos would end up paying way more, and as a result, the government would be getting way more in taxes. That's going to be super important, I think, as especially in traditional debate, because a lot of times the negative might come up and be like, well, we have all these different taxes. Knowing the definition of the wealth tax specifically, as opposed to things like income and capital gains, is going to be super important. So, with that in mind and these definitions in mind, let's look into plans. How are wealth taxes implemented? Okay, so right now, going around in like legalese and in political events, there's two main plans that are being suggested. First is the Warren tax, which is suggested by Elizabeth Warren, Massachusetts senator. Basically, this plan is that you would tax those with wealth $50 million and over. So for every dollar of wealth you have over $50 million, you would have to pay 2 cents in tax, and this would bring in $3 trillion over 10 years. And this would be a yearly tax. Um, one of the biggest things to note here is that it differs in this, like, from the income tax, where the income tax would obviously affect those who are like not earning that much, but a wealth tax, most of the plans only affect those who are like making significant amounts of money and they basically could theoretically afford this kind of tax. One thing to note about the Warren tax is that it's not bracketed at all. So instead of it being like a different percent of your money, based on your bracket. So for example, if you're making between 50 million to 60 million, or if your wealth is 50 million to 60 million, you have to pay a certain amount, and then 60 million to 70 million, you have to pay a certain amount, as do most, that's how most income taxes and capital gains taxes work. You're going to be paying for like 2 cents for every dollar. On the other hand, you have the Sanders plan, which is suggested by Bernie Sanders. This one applies to those with $32 million in assets and over, and it's bracket based. So what I just explained, where it's like, oh, there's a certain like group of people, they have to pay this much percent, and then this bigger group, then the next group of people has to pay a certain percent, and that would be a progressive tax that increases with the amount of assets you have. Okay, main things to take away from this. One, doesn't affect those who are in poverty, middle class Americans. It only affects the elite. Second thing to take away, you're going to have to specify how, like, very specifically how your plan is going to work. Is it going to be yearly? Who is it going to apply to? Is it 32 million? Is it 50 million? And as a result, you're going to have to, and the third thing you're also going to have to specify is it something like the Warren tax where it's 2 cents for every dollar, or is it bracket based? I don't think this is going to have too much of an impact on solvency, but I do think it's going to be important in order to clarify your app. Okay, so with that, let's go into some history and background. So right now, the United States does not have a wealth tax, but in 1935, FDR tried to implement this funky wealth tax. It ended up falling apart, but he basically did this to bring in a lot of revenue for the government during like the Great Depression in order to help finance it. I think one of the biggest implications of this is the fact that when you have a wealth tax, you're able to finance a lot of government programs, and the historical point of it has been when our country is in times of need, when we don't have enough money to finance essential programs, we turn to taxing the wealthy, and as a result are able to gain the revenue we need in order to pay for these essential programs. I think this is going to have a huge implication in debate this year. You can talk about different core events, pandemics, like the risk of new pandemics, needing to address climate change, etc. We'll get into that more when we talk about AF plans, but historically it has been used to like for a specific issue in a way. Okay, in 1893, on the other hand, I don't know why I didn't put this in order, but 1893, what you did is that you had Michigan taxed all property at face value. So what it did, rather than taxing things like, oh, your income, they did tax your property as well. And I know it seems very similar to a property tax, but in essence they were just calculating more of an asset-based tax. Over time it kind of fell apart and ended up devolving into what we now have as a property tax, as an income tax. But in 1893, you didn't have all these things, so it was this one big tax rather than having all these separate taxes. Okay. Then in 1990, if you want to look to other countries, you had 12 European countries implement the wealth tax, and it was exactly what we were talking about. It was very similar to things like the Warren Plan. Currently, you just have Switzerland, Norway, and Spain. I think these countries are going to be super, super important to look into when you're thinking about solvency, when you're looking to real life examples for how it was implemented. Those places are where you're going to want to focus your research, because those are the places where you have an actual wealth tax and where it's consistently being implemented. So in terms of more background, what are you seeing in the United States right now? Lots of tax evasion. So this is what I was talking about when I was going into the capital gains and income tax. Just Google how to evade my taxes, and you'll see 400 YouTube videos about how to get around it. Point being, there is a lot of tax evasion, especially by elites. You're seeing it done by major corporations, billionaires. They're hiding their assets and bank accounts in like other countries to get away from paying taxes. There's a lot of it. So, what are the two implications of this? One, you could go in one huge direction where it's like, oh, a wealth tax can help check back on this because it's your assets in general, right? It should be able to check back on the fact that, like, oh, people are hiding away from income, like loopholes in using loopholes in income taxes and then paying a lot less with capital gains taxes, i.e., if you get your income in stocks, you're paying way less taxes because you're not paying as hefty of an income tax. You're just paying a smaller capital gains tax when you sell those stocks. So you could take that avenue where it's like, oh, wealth tax, and solves for tax evasion. On the other hand, I think this is going to be a major area of neg research. I think a lot of the neg, as I'll get into later, will focus on things like solvency deficits and we'll be like, yo, tax evasion. Like, we're not going to be able to solve back for any of the issues of the F because all the billionaires are going to make bank accounts in other countries. That being said, tax evasion is going to be a major thing I think we want to look into on both the F and the neg. Okay, some more history and more current events, or I guess background. Bolivia had a wealth tax to pay for the pandemic. So, this is what I was saying earlier with the 1935 wealth tax. A lot of times, wealth taxes are being used for a specific issue. Bolivia didn't have a long reaching wealth tax that went for, multiple years. They just taxed the wealthy because they needed money to pay for the pandemic, and that basically effectively worked out and gave the government extra revenue. Again, I think that's going to be a major thing that a lot of AFs reference. The last thing is that G20 is currently trying to enforce a global minimum tax on billionaires. This has more to do with like an income tax, and it's honestly been very vague as to like how it's gonna work and what they're doing. It hasn't really been working out. They're not the best at getting things done, but they're basically trying to make it so that every country has to tax billionaires by or every country has to tax billionaires by a certain amount. Like they all have to pay like XYZ% tax. I think this could turn into some sort of counterplan on the neg, but I think in general it could just be interesting to look into if you're curious about other tax plans, what's in the process right now, what the current global scale. Okay, so that's it for history and background. Major takeaways: look into how wealth taxes have been applied. Are they applied to specific issues? And secondly, definitely research these European countries. And thirdly, definitely research tax evasion. Cool. So, what about the history in debate? One of the biggest things you have to keep in mind is that this is not a living wage 2.0. I know. When I thought this topic came out, I was just like, no, I'm going to be debating the living wage again. No. Why? A living wage directly helps those who are in poverty and those like middle class workers, I guess, right? It is money that is directly being given to them. They can spend it how they want. On the other hand, the wealth tax is on the rich, and now the government is deciding how they're going to distribute the money, what they're going to put the money into, right? There's going to be a lot of arguments where it's like, oh, hey, the government is not going to do a great job with this money. It's not going to help low income workers. You're not going to see reduced income inequality. So you might see a diversion rather from every AF being about income inequality, every AF being about racial and gender equality. You might see more AFs talking about how is the government going to spend this money? Is it going to be towards safety nets, or is it going to be towards things like the military, pandemics, etc.? So in that sense, it is very different from the living wage. The second thing to kind of take into account is that we've never had the word tax in an LD or policy topic before. So I guess what that means, it is going to be a little hard to like, scour the wiki and find a lot of things. But that being said, there have been a lot of really economic safety net related programs, right? You can look to a living wage, you can look to UBI, right? Universal Basic Income, which was the policy topic a while ago. You can look to jobs guarantee files, etc. There's so many things on OpenEv that you could definitely look into for help and for a lot of research on this topic. I think this could also be a great place to find counterplans, right? If you want to go for some sort of inequality advantage counterplan, right? You could go for a living wage advantage counterplan. So I think looking into those will help you figure out how you're gonna frame the F, but also give you a lot of neg ideas. The next thing you can look into is that the policy debate had a fiscal redistribution topic. That is very similar to this topic, and it can definitely be something that you utilize and something to research. The Green New Deal app has a lot of wealth tax files. The Green New Deal is basically about solving for climate change and investing in things like renewable energy. And there are a lot of files based on, I think it was like funding it through a wealth tax. So I think that could be a really cool app to have on this topic, and looking into those things can be perfect. So, main takeaways. One, this is not a living wage. But two, even though it's not a living wage, and even though we haven't talked about taxes, there is a ton of things you can look into on OpenEv, on all those different websites. Okay, so with that, let's get into the actual arguments on this topic. I know I've hinted at them, I know I kind of diverged, but let's get into the nitty-gritty. So, first, starting with traditional debate, value criterions. So I think the biggest ones on this topic, structural violence and justice. It's going to be a huge topic in terms of addressing income inequality, right? There's going to be a lot of apps that are going to be like, hey, we can tax the wealthy and then use that to invest in safety net programs. And that can be an amazing structural violence app, amazing justice focused app. On the other hand, there can also be a lot of util apps. There's a lot of extinction level impacts when it comes to income inequality. But if you also want to focus in your app on, well, actually, it's more likely that the money is going to go towards XYZ program. And in that sense, you can talk about the wealth tax in that sense and go for a utilitarian framework. The fourth thing I think we could go into is like a maintaining democracy framework. Definitely put a question mark there because I'm not 100% sure, but I feel like there are income inequality links into, having a strong and just democracy, and a democracy needing to help everyone equally. I think it is going to be a bit weird when you're thinking about the neg and you're like, wait, but like, shouldn't people be able to do what they want? So that's why I feel like maintaining democracy can be a little weird, but I think it could definitely go into this. Now, I didn't put this on the file, on the slide, because honestly I know this varies from circuit to circuit and state to state, but I think or like traditional type philosophy arguments are going to be great. I'm going to have a phil section later in this topic analysis, so if you want to fast forward to that, you can definitely go ahead. But if you're going to a circuit where you have people where you can explain a like libertarianism framework too, that's going to be amazing on the neg. I think there's a lot of philosophers talking about things like income inequality and why we should equalize things, where you can go on the app. So you can go with like Kant or Hegel, or on the neg, you could go like, oh, government shouldn't be intervening in these kinds of things. They shouldn't be taxing the wealthy in the first place. In which case, you could cite like a very good libertarianism NC. And I think that could be a very strong strategy on the neg. I just don't know how much that flies at a lot of traditional tournaments. And I know that on my circuit, it would be very hard to explain. I don't know about yours. So, what is the AF going to look like? I think the most predictable AF on this topic, and the most like feasible looking AF, I guess, in a sense, is going to be that money will go to safety net programs, right? It's going to be a little hard to just like explain on a traditional circuit to be like, actually, we're going to give the money to climate change programs. And there are going to be a lot of questions over like, can you fiat that the money is just going to go to solving climate change? Can you fiat that the money is going to go towards saving the military? I think on a logical sense, it makes most sense to be like, oh, you're going to tax the wealthy and then use that towards safety net programs. That is what people like Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders are advocating for, and I think that's what you're going to find the most evidence for. So in that sense, what kind of apps could you have? You could, one, have an income inequality app, talk about reducing racial and gender inequality, allowing people to actually have, these more substantial safety net programs, food assistance being bettered, etc. There's so many ways you can go with that, but the main thing being like, oh, we can just make it so that people are able to have a better standard of living, and you're able to reduce inequality. That again would be the structural violence impact, but you could also take this with an economy impact. Inequality is really, really bad for the economy. It decks things like consumer spending. But thirdly, it actually, yeah, it just hard with this. Okay, then you can just go into like general public goods. I think you just be like, oh, it's a generally good thing in order to like give these assistance programs. But I think the best impact is definitely to go for some sort of inequality argument. Then there's some things I've seen online about like productive investment, where it's like, oh, it's like when you tax the wealthy and then you invest it into these programs, it's like a good investment, and now people have more consumer, like if now you're providing better safety nets to people, that's going to be better for the economy, and they're able to invest in different things, which is going to be better. Okay. Thirdly, with safety net programs, this isn't on the slide, but I think you could definitely talk about things like furthering things like Social Security because we're having a bit of crisis with Social Security and the money might be running out pretty soon. So you could talk about investing in that and how that's essential to maximizing equality in the future. You could also talk about various healthcare programs. The next main area of the topic and the main topic part of the AF, I think, is going to be negatives of overaccumulation by elites. I think this could be a morality argument where it's like, oh, like people should have a sense of equality. You know, you're seeing massive, massive raises in the wage gap, and you're seeing elites being able to accumulate. You're seeing, as a result, they're able to influence the government way more than the bottom percent are. And as a result, you can just be like, over accumulation is bad. We should have to reduce that wealth. I do think that there are going to be some problems with this app in the sense that, like, you're not really making the elite like go down to middle class level, right? Like they're still making $50 billion a year and like, okay, they have to pay a tax. They're still so much richer than everyone else. But I think you can still make, I think this is still a good argument to be made. Okay, what about the neg? The neg is kind of hard on this topic. I'm not gonna lie. There aren't a ton of disads with a lot of proof, but it's definitely doable. That being said, there are so many econ disads you can read. Don't feel disparaged. However, I do think the best strat is something like counterplans, especially if you factor in, like, you could go for a really cool next strat where it's like a ton of solvency deficits on the AF, where you're like tax evasion, blah 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 blah. IRS won't be able to handle this. Government won't be able to actually handle, like, not won't won't know what to do with the revenue, won't be able to manage it efficiently. And as a result, we should do XYZ counterplan. We should do a living wage. We should provide a universal basic income. We should give a federal jobs guarantee. You know, that would be amazing strat. But then I know you have like your CFL circuits. I don't really know many other circuits, but like CFL doesn't allow counterplans. So what should the strat be? I think there are a lot of economic disads on this topic. So the first one is going to be like investment, and I think you can combine that with entrepreneurship. What this is saying is that the wealthy, when they're being taxed on their assets as a whole, they're going to be less likely to want to invest their money, and they're going to be less likely to innovate a lot because they're like, oh, well, I'm just going to be taxed a ton of money on this, all right? I'm going to be paying 2 cents for every dollar, which does add up. Like, I'm making so much less money, so might as well just not do anything. So as a result, that's just really bad for the economy as a whole. If you don't see as much investment, if you don't see as much innovation, if you don't see as many businesses, that is the potential of crashing the economy. And I think you can make a very good impact scenario with that. The next thing that the next argument that I think could be right on this topic is capital flight. So capital flight is when basically all the rich people like flee. Like they literally are like, "Oh my God, taxes," and they go and book it to like Australia where they don't have to pay their taxes. Alternatively, they just move their accounts to like, you know, like secretive accounts in the middle of Europe where they're not having to pay taxes, you know? All those kind of tax evasion type stuff, but escalated to the next level. I think that would be a very good disad and being like, oh, you're incentivizing this kind of stuff. Okay. Charity. There is a charity disad I saw going out where it was just like basically instead of a wealth, it was kind of like a counterplan in a sense, but it was just like, okay, I think the main argument is just that what happens is that when you have a wealth tax, rich people are less likely to give to charity because they're like, well, all my money is being going, and I'm not actually getting helped by this, and I'm paying all these taxes. So then they want to conserve their money, and they're less likely to engage in things like philanthropy. This is really bad because philanthropy is actually net better. You actually have a guarantee that it's going to a lot of good organizations. In the other hand, you don't know what the government is going to do with this money. Again, combining it with the solvency deficits, I think this would be a wonderful decide. Then there's liquidation, where it's basically like, oh, like wealthy people will liquidize their, is that the word? Liquidize? Liquidate? Liquidate. Whatever. They would sell off, basically saying that they would sell off their assets. And again, this controls the internal link to economy. So, for example, if they have a lot of properties, they know that they're losing money. They don't think it's as much of a profitable investment anymore. And thus, they kind of just sell off these stuff. They liquidize their assets so that they don't have to pay these things. So, that being said, there are a lot of ways you can go with the economy, and when you combine it with solvency deficits, you can be like, well, there's a 2% risk that the AF can solve, and a very high chance that you're going to crash the economy, or you're going to see a stock market crash due to a lack of investment. And that can paint a very good narrative on the neg. If you are allowed to leave a counterplan, like I said earlier, I think there's so many fantastic options on this topic. You can look to capital other taxes. You can like change capital gains taxes so that's higher. I don't really know what the net benefit of this would be. I think that if you do more research into how different taxes work and the different benefits of different taxes, it could be wonderful. You could look to the earned income tax credit to solve for any sort of inequality advantage on the AF, which earned income tax credit is basically like if you're making below a certain amount, the government will literally give you money. So it's like a living wage, but instead of being paid by corporations, you're being paid by the government. I think that would be very cool, solve any sort of inequality AF. You could talk about a payroll tax being better. And then, like I said earlier, you can go for ways to ensure that money is being used in a good way, like federal jobs guarantee, living wages, universal basic income. Okay, so that is what we have for the traditional and egg. I think this is going to be a very good topic. Don't be disparaged by the fact being like, well, a wealth tax seems like a good idea. There's a lot of solvency deficits. There's a lot of econ dissets. I think that this would be a very cool topic. Okay, let's look on to progressive debate. I think even if you're a traditional debater, it can be worth sticking around for this section because I'm going to go into a lot of plan Fs and fill arguments that I think would be cool to run in a sort of traditionalized way. Okay, LARPAF. So a lot of it has to like do with what I said earlier. I think the main way that the app is going to frame itself on this topic is that it's going to have different plans for what the money is going to fund. There are people who are going to be like, well, Meera, isn't this extra topical? Isn't this violate topicality? Okay, like plans have existed in LG forever. Like I think it's a reasonable guess to say like, okay, this will happen. So what will happen is that you will see plans for what the money is going to fund. So you well tax the wealthy, you're going to do what Bolivia did and do it to fund disease responses. You can go for a pandemics app. There could be a general healthcare app where it's like our healthcare system is failing, we need revenue for it. Wealth tax solves. You could have a social security app where you talk about well, social security is running out and like the money for is running out. We need money for that, and the only way is through a wealth tax. This is really good for the economy. You can go for a military app where it's like, oh, well, we need to put more money into our military, or we can use this money to fund different conflicts and fund our responses in different conflicts. Obviously, a little controversial, but I think it could definitely be a very good app. There's a lot of military apps out there. There's a Green New Deal app where that you could be like, oh, we're going to invest in renewable tech, we're going to solve climate change, and then there could have a climate app. There could be cybersecurity, paying off federal debt. Like, I think there's just an infinite number of apps, and I know I'm literally proving topicality true right now, but there are so many ways you can go with like investing the money and what the government can do with the revenue from a wealth tax, right? Like, remember Elizabeth Warren's plan? It was going to make like $3 trillion at over 10 years. Like, but if and that was only if you tax people with $50 million of assets and more. If you lowered that, like there's trillions of dollars in revenue. What are you going to do with that revenue? That is going to be the app. There's so many advantage areas based on that. Okay. The second app that you could go, if you're not going to go for this whole like LARP app, like, oh, this is where the money's going to go, it's going to go, and you're going to go with this kind of like most logical path and the things that like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders are advocating for, as we talked about earlier, in reducing like income inequality. I think there's a very good iLaw app to be had where it's like, oh, we are violating, like, this helps strengthen international law, helps strengthen equality, helps strengthen, like, when we have social safety nets that lessens poverty, which helps us reach XYZ UN sustainable UN goal, helps us fulfill XYZ treaty, which then strengthens us in the international sphere. I think you can definitely go for an iLaw app. You saw these iLaw apps, not as much on the living wage topic, but last year's right to housing topic, I think had a lot of iLaw stuff, and I think this could be very cool. Yeah. Okay, so what about the LARP neg? First of all, the econ dissets. Econ dissets are going to be everywhere. As I talk about in the trad section, you're going to see these investment dissets, entrepreneurship, yeah, the charity dissat. I'm kind of forgetting everything I went over. But basically, all those classic, oh, it's going to be bad for the economy, the rich people are going to flee, etc. Then I think you might see that like some sort of process counter plans and where it's like, oh, we're going to implement this a different way. You could kind of exploit this definition of adopt to be like, well, adopt doesn't say it's going to be through legislative means, and we're going to do it through these means. There could be, sunsets counterplans where it's like, oh, it's going to expire after 5 years. Like your classic process counterplans that you see on every topic, I think you're going to definitely see on this topic. Then you could also see delay counterplans. This would be very good paired with some sort of elections decide. Right, being like, oh, we'll do this after 5 months after blah 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 thing because XYZ event needs to happen. Otherwise, we'll see major gridlock. Okay, so the election decide. If you're debating this topic before the election, which I'm assuming with the publishing of like when this topic analysis is, I don't know how many of you will be. I do think that you could go for an elections decide. Obviously, the election is about to happen, so I don't know how viable of a strat that is going to be. However, I do think that you can be a lot of politics decides. A couple link stories. So the first link story I think you can go with politics is, oh, rich people control a lot of like legislation, right? And they are the core of our lawmaking. They are the like most of the laws that get passed are because the rich people in society. That's just a fact. When you tax the rich, they're going to be really mad. And as a result, they're going to lobby for different programs that might actually cut back on federal assistance programs, that might cut back on the things. And they might try to affect A, where their money is going, or B, just wreck any benefit of the AF by making it so that you're not actually getting the benefit of federal assistance programs. But secondly, I think there is a politics decide you could go for within Congress. I'm not really sure how this would work. I feel like you could go for some sort of like gridlock argument, but I think the better argument to go for is like rich people hate the plan, rich people mess up politics. Yeah. Okay. Advantage counter plans, wonderful with combined with solvency deficits. As we were just talking about in the traditional section, I think you go for federal jobs guarantee, universal basic income, etc. There are so many advantage counter plans. Look at any economy topic we've had. Numerous policy topics have talked about this. I think you'll see them all over the circuit. Okay. With that, let's move into critique AFs, soft left AFs. Okay. Number one, when you're going for this sort of inequality type AF that I was talking about earlier, where you're going for some sort of like, oh, we're able to solve inequality by investing in social safety net programs, I think you could definitely go for some sort of racial cap AF or just solving inequities within society. You could just have a very long framing section as to why this should come as a prior question or why combating capitalism should always come first. And I think that would be a very kind of simple AF to go for. You could combine this, or this could be complemented by some sort of reparations app where it's like, oh, having a wealth tax is a form of reparations, and that would definitely work out very well. The third thing I think you could see on this topic is a FEMAF. Honestly, I wasn't too sure how you would see this. I was just thinking of it more in the sense where it's like, oh, you could invest in programs that could specifically help increase equality for women and as a result help women advance in society. Do I think you might run into some problems with topicality there and being very specific? Yes. But is it like still a wealth tax? Are you still, topical in terms of like T framework? Yeah, so I think it could make a very good soft left app. You're just gonna have to be prepared for those like T subsets and T specification, like whatever, type T shells, but I think it would be a very strong app where you can have a very good framework session as to why, we need to prioritize reducing gender inequality. The fourth thing, I was thinking that there are gonna be apps that like have some sort of symbolic meaning of the word tax. I'm thinking mostly in the sense of like a set call app where it's like, I don't actually know how this would work. And I do think, like, I do know that the idea of like a tax in itself is like a massive set call link. But I do think you could go from some sort of like symbolic meaning of the word tax and what it means to tax wealth, what wealth is in the first place, and go for some sort of non-TF. Obviously, I think that's going to come with a lot of research into the meaning of how a tax could be applied and what it actually means. But I think it could be a viable strat, some sort of semi-topical AF. Obviously, this is just like a general idea. But I think it's something you're going to see on the circuit as you do with like any other topic, right? You always see some sort of like more symbolic meaning. In terms of non-TFs, obviously you can go anywhere you want in terms of non-T, right? They could be absolutely anything. But in terms of like quasi-topical, I'm gonna twist the topic and directly critique the topic apps rather than being more of a vague critique of debate. I think you're gonna see non-T set call and you're just gonna see non-T cap. And then the idea of set call, if you look into the living wage topic, there were a lot of critiques of the idea of wealth in the first place and what wealth means in correlation to land and how we view land as wealth. but obviously that is inherently colonialist and we have stolen this land. And I think you could kind of look at a, I wonder if you could just have a set collab where like wealth tax is a form of decolonization. I know it seems like a stretch, but I do think it could be a viable non-TF on the topic. CapAF would be very, very non-topical. You would be directly critiquing the topic and the idea of property and the idea of taxes. But obviously most of the AF would be built around the fact that the topic is bad, being like rather than being like a vague or like or interpretation of the topic. Okay, critiques on the neck. As always, you could probably go for, any sort of your generic critiques like Afropess, Queerpess, disability, etc. I think you will see them on the neg. You'll see the idea of wealth being critiqued, the idea of what a tax is, and who is taxed in society and how taxes apply to people. And I think you would definitely see a lot of like identity-based arguments. Other in addition to that, you'll see cap, as I was talking about with the non-TF. I think you could be looking at taxes being, a form of capitalist, like a way of capitalists getting ahead in the first place, and how they are just a form of pacification, where it's just like, oh yes, let's make everything better by taxing the wealthy, and we're gonna have all these equality, but like you're still relying on a system of capitalist exploitation that hurts the working class capitalist, So I think that would be a very good cap K, and I think that there are a lot of links you go for that. Set call. A lot of things. I think the main link is first going to be a link about what wealth is, and I think the idea of land as wealth, and there are a lot of critiques of the idea of how colonists came and they destroyed the way that indigenous people view wealth in the first place and what wealth is. Like they associated land with wealth, but that is not the way it was, and how indigenous people viewed land, right? And continue to view land. But secondly, I think there's the notion of property, right? When you're inherently having a wealth tax, you're taxing this idea of property, and the way we conceive of property right now is inherently colonialist, and the idea of property is colonialist. The idea of taxes in itself are colonialist. So I think that those will be very strong topic links to SATCOM. Thirdly, I think you could read general postmodern critiques. I think biopolitics would be great on this topic, looking into how you're trying to expand state control by taking away the money and then giving the government infinite power, and how that is a way of controlling people. I'm not too familiar with biopolitics literature, aside from like Foucault, to be honest, but I do think that is a thing. One of the biggest things, I guess, just my fourth point going into critiques, is that I think you're gonna have to focus on representations rather than a direct material K, because the perm evidence is gonna be very good, right? So if you're going for some sort of like disability argument on the like critique on the neg, right, and critiquing the idea of wealth and taxes, you're gonna have to go for it inherently as reps, because if you try to go for it as a material critique, the av is just gonna come up here and be like, well, when we invest in social safety nets, those are going to ultimately benefit people who have disabilities, right? I think that's going to be the material aspect of this. It's going to be hard to go for a critique in the material aspect, and especially with the cap K as well. There's still, yes, a tax in itself is inherently capitalist, and the idea of wealth is capitalist, but is taxing the wealthy and then giving that money to using that money to give programs that guarantee basic needs for people, like that is a kind of socialist leaning program, right? It is a social democrat program. So as a result, the perm evidence on that is very strong. So that's definitely something to keep in mind when you're going for critiques. You're going to want to make them more like, the racial cap stuff, the reps set call, reps disability, etc. Going for state bad arguments, and no matter what critique you're reading, is going to be very important. Okay, with that, let's move into Phil. Okay, number 1 and 2. Kant and Hegel, the idea of equality of opportunity and how you should be able to, inherently people should be given a wealth tax, and you should be minimizing income inequality, because inequality in itself, on terms of Kant, would kind of be like Kant kind of makes a lot of critiques of things like inequality. Hegel would probably argue that things like inequality prohibit you from being able to access your whatever it's called. I'm blanking on the name, but I think Kant and Hegel would both affirm in terms of like the idea of income inequality. Here's the issue with Kant and Hegel. I think it's very easy to accidentally make your arguments consequential, right? You're gonna be like, oh, we tax you arguments need to be about the inherent nature of a wealth tax rather than they're asking for inherent nature of a wealth tax rather than an effect of it, right? If you go for something like, oh, we're going to mitigate inequality, you're going to have to win that mitigating inequality is inherent to a wealth tax in the first place and not an effect of a wealth tax. Otherwise, you risk being consequential and then delinking from Kant and Hegel and linking into some sort of util framework and then just you losing the util debate, if that makes sense. Or just not having any offense in the debate, in which case you could just lose to Kant or Hegel negates in terms of taxes being bad. So that's one thing that you're going to have to be careful. And the next thing I think that's why I think Phil is going to be wonky on this topic. Someone who's more into Phil is definitely arguing with me right now and being like, oh, Meera, this is a wonderful Phil topic. These are my general ideas as someone who doesn't read Phil arguments as much, but knows how Phil usually operates in the circuit and sees people reading Phil. Okay, the next thing I think you could definitely read is some sort of Rawls framework. I know this isn't always seen in circuit debate, but there was a Rawls app on the living wage topic that I do think makes a decent argument as to why, in itself, like income inequality is bad. And I think it could be easier to go for this idea of a wealth tax inherently being good because Rawls talks about this idea of, the veil of ignorance and making sure that everyone has, like, making sure that things are equitable in the first place, which I think could link very well into this topic. The next thing could be virtue ethics being some sort of like some inherent part of a wealth tax and some inherent part of limiting inequality is in itself virtuous and helps promote virtuous ways. Then you can see polls as you see on like pretty much every Phil after neg where it's like, oh, people agree with this, we should do it. Maybe not the most strategic Phil argument, but I do think it can be made. The last thing, social contract apps, where it's like, oh, you give up I okay, honestly, I think it would be a little weird to go for social contract, but you could definitely make the argument that like a it is part of like the government being able to like provide these programs and minimize inequality is a positive and flows into the social contract. But I also think you would be able to turn offense on the neg and be like, oh, in this sense, taxes are justifiable because we give up our rights in order for the government to maximize things like equality and maintain order. Maybe not the strongest argument in my opinion on this topic, but I think again you could definitely go for it. Okay, Phil on the neg. Kant and Hegel, you could definitely go for just like your traditional like taxing be bad, don't you're stealing people's property, you're mandating to do things that in itself is inherently bad under both Kant and Hegel, and I think that you could very easily use that as a reason why the Phil negates. I think one of the best frameworks on this topic is going to be libertarianism. Like literally, a wealth tax is so like oh my God, libertarianism would be so against the wealth tax, right? Because you're just going for this idea that government intervention in the economy and government like taxes in the first place are just inherently bad. And I think that is definitely the place where you see the clearest offense, right? You're not making a stretch where it's like, oh, but it might be consequential. And the Kant and Hegel stuff, you've seen taxation on literally every single topic, right? Libertarianism, I think, is one of the like clearest things where it's like wealth tax, libertarianism. It would make a very good argument. Okay, topicality and theory. And I'm realizing, side note, that I'm being very biased in my portrayal of these arguments. I don't know. I think you can just get random thoughts, opinions on these topics. If you think an argument that I said is bad is really good, honestly, just let me know. Like I'm very curious to see how a lot of these Phil arguments play out, and I want to see them play out. I just honestly am unsure of how some of them operate. Okay, topicality and theory. Spec shells, number one, spec shells. Like I think that's gonna be major, right? I think that if you're reading an app and you don't want it to link into the spec shell, here's what you need to do. You need to specify the plan that you're using. I think you should probably go with something like the Warren tax or the Sanders because that is a very clear text that you can be like, search this up. It is the biggest thing being read right now. Like, it would delink you from a lot of spec shells. Secondly, you need to specify where the money is going. If an app doesn't do this and they just say like we implement a wealth tax as per XYZ plan, we would bracket give this much. You could definitely read a spec shell where it's like must specify where the money is going, must specify how it's enforced. Your classic spec shells, but I think on a topic like a wealth tax, where there genuinely are a lot of things you need to specify in order to understand the app, understand who it applies to, I think the like abuse story in terms of going for a spec shell is much better and will help beat that high a lot of judges have a high threshold for voting on spec, but I do think that this is a topic where you can make a very persuasive spec shell. Okay, Number two, T subsets. I don't know how much like this is gonna be read because like I don't know why you would like read an app that's like, oh, we're only gonna tax real estate, right? Like I do think like someone could do it, and I do think there's probably some strategic benefit of that I'm like randomly missing. But I do think like if someone's going for an app that's just like, oh, we're going to only tax XYZ asset, then it's like, okay, so then won't people just move their wealth and invest into other stuff? Question mark. So it like begs the question of like, will TC subsets actually be big on this topic? I'm not sure about that. On the other hand, I think T extra is going to be huge on this topic, right? Can't specify where the money is goes. Someone's going to be like, oh, Meera, this T extra argument you're making is actually a formulation of T subset. Ugh, okay? My point being is that there's going to be a lot of topicality arguments being like, interpretation, the affirmative debater must not specify where the money goes, right? It allows you to fiat literally helping any program. There are literally so many apps, climate change, military, federal, blah, 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 any social safety net, any random program. Let's invest in this. Let's put our money into this. There are literally infinite number of apps. Like, no kidding. So I think going for T Extra is going to be very big on this topic. And I do think you will see a good debate in terms of apps that like specify, oh, we're going to invest in education versus the neg being like, well, you shouldn't be able to just fiat that you help random programs when in reality, this is how the government would probably spend the money. Then there's probably going to be T wealth tax, just like, your general, like, on the living wage topic, you saw T living wage. This is what a living wage should be. You do not follow that definition, etc. I don't think it's like the most strategic to be like, well, actually, you only tax those who are making over $50 million, but my definition says that it should be over $32 million because really, what is the abuse story there? But if someone is genuinely like violating the definition of a wealth tax, if it's more of an income, if they're defending, I don't know, like an expansion of a capital gains tax, which honestly I think wealth tax covers capital, whatever, just your classic definition debate where it's just like they're not following, T framework, etc. Then T temporal, I think that this could be an argument. I do feel like most people are gonna go for some sort of app where it's like, yes, the wealth tax is a yearly thing. But I think that you could read a T argument where it's just like, no, the wealth tax would be a one-time thing, right? In Bolivia, for example, I think they only just taxed the wealth. They were like, hey, wealthy people, we're taking your money to pay for the pandemic. It wasn't like a yearly thing. So I think that could be something. You could also like make the argument, yeah, I put sunsets on here, but I don't think you're gonna see that. Sunsets is like the argument that I think it's like, oh, it lasts for 5 years, and then like you have to renew it. But you should definitely look into that argument. I don't know if it's the best T argument. Then there's going to be T adopt, this the process through which the app actually like it has a wealth tax in the first place, i.e. is it through Congress, i.e. is it passed through something else? I do think most apps will be topical in the sense where it will be passed through Congress, but there is definitely a T debate to be had in case someone doesn't. Okay. So those are the main arguments. I hope this topic analysis definitely helped. Main takeaways, there are so many apps you could have on this topic, so many different things to research. On the neg, I think econ dissets are going to be huge. I think setcall, I think cap, all those kind of critiques are going to be huge. There's a great libertarianism NC to have. So I hope you guys have fun with this topic. Let me know if you have any questions, I guess in the comments and stuff. I think their EIF will be holding a question and answer session, so look out for the dates for that. If you have any questions, feel free to attend that and reach out and have fun debating this topic. Bye.